you're adjusting, so I just keep talking. Okay, great. I can't see what I'm talking about here, so I'm going to be turning around. I'll have to look up here. Thank you so much for coming. I'm sure this is not the most romantic of topics to discuss on Valentine's Day morning. And I would say I'll do my best, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to make any links to love. Sorry. And yeah, so Kate did a great job of telling you who I am, which is what I wanted to tell you a little bit, but you covered it. I'm trying to think if there's anything else you need to know. Oh, and so some people get really annoyed with trigger warnings and think that we do this too much, and we're not really going to be discussing specific traumas in detail, but just anytime you're talking about something that's really hard that has to do with trauma, you know that you're welcome to get up and leave the room if you need to, go get a drink, just do whatever you need to do to kind of calm yourself down. And I do appreciate questions in the midst of when I'm talking. Don't let me get like 5 slides down and be like, oh, wait. Just so go ahead and interrupt, raise your hand, whatever. And if you have to flag me down because I'm talking too fast, that's great. And a question, how many therapists are in the room? Golly. Okay, medical professionals? Okay, so you all are experts as well. If you have other things you want to add, and even if you're not, you have your own experience that you bring and your knowledge, so please feel free to add that to the conversation. I really am more comfortable with back and forth dialogue, but I had so much stuff I want to cover that you'll have to interrupt me, and like I'm happy to have a back and forth, but then we may not get through everything, but oh well. Okay, so we're going to talk about all this stuff today, right? The definition of trauma, thinking about trauma, the brain, the body, how that affects us, the idea of transgenerational trauma or intergenerational trauma, and then we're going to connect it, trauma and minorities, to connect what you've been doing with what I'm talking about, and then brain wiring and majorities, and then thinking about how we can apply strategies of healing that we use in individual settings, perhaps in a system level. Yeah, are you ready for the journey?
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. So what is trauma? What is trauma to you all? Without looking up there too much. What do you think of when you think of trauma? Yes? Hurt. Okay. What kind of hurt?
Emotional or physical.
Well, that covers it. All right. Thank you. Yeah, so we have an official definition. The DSM-5 is what therapists and psychiatrists use. It's our diagnostic manual, and it has its own definition, which I kind of summarized. It's dynamic. It changes from edition to edition, but it really talks about exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence through directly experiencing it, witnessing it, learning about it, or repeated exposure to details about it. So they're trying to cover all the people that might have been traumatized, although they have a very specific thing they're talking about when they talk about actual serious, they're talking about a threat to your physical integrity, usually. We're moving the conversation a little bit beyond that. I would like for the DSM to move beyond that, but they haven't yet. So what we are going to think about, and I think where the field is going, is thinking, have you heard this idea of, instead of saying, what is wrong with you, thinking about what has happened to you. So a lot of the things that we see happening to people, maybe it has to do with something that's happened to them. Maybe it's trauma. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Have you heard that idea before, the shift of what is wrong with you to what's happened to you? Mm-hmm. I know that there's a big push right now, Channel 5, and some others are participating in something called Alive and Well. Have you been exposed to any of that? So there's a community-wide effort to think about trauma, and that's one of the ideas that they're pushing forward. So when I think about trauma, I've always talked about it in terms of big T and little t trauma. What does that mean? So for me, big T trauma is what we just talked about, that threat to your physical integrity, which would be what is discussed in the DSM. And then there's a small t trauma, so it's not necessarily what's in the DSM. It's not, I witnessed a car accident or I was in a car accident, but it's something more like, something that's just really upsetting to me, where I feel like I probably don't have a lot of power in the situation. So, and I'm going to go over some examples of that, because that's a really big continuum, right, of we have some really serious threats to your physical safety over here, and then and your continuum probably is different than other people's continuum, so we'll talk about that. Then there's something called complex trauma, which also is not necessarily entirely recognized in our diagnostic manual, and if you know anything about medicine, you can get into the politics of what happens to how to get something into the diagnostic manual. But complex trauma has to do with severe, prolonged, and repeated trauma. Usually in an interpersonal nature, but not necessarily. So basically, we have something bad that happens to you, is what we're talking about, something that hurts you, physically or emotionally. And then often this sense of powerlessness. Are we tracking so far? Okay, good. Feel free to give me a lot of head nods. That makes me really know what I'm talking about. All right, so we have the brain. I don't know if I didn't have an anatomy class, so I don't know if you covered this in anatomy. And really what we're learning about the brain is changing all the time. I heard a presentation once by a guy who does a lot of studies of the brain, and he said really what you want to do when you hear anybody talk about what happens in the brain is it's like you don't want to marry that information, you want to take it out and date it a little bit, but don't marry it. Because basically it's changing all the time, and we don't know we're not really definitively sure about the brain. So I'm going to give you some ideas, and these ideas are continually being explored and being further researched. So we have the amygdala. Anybody ever heard of the amygdala? Some of you, yes, especially the therapists and the medical professionals in the room and everybody else. Yeah. So that's, I think so if you like make a fist with your hand, the amygdala is buried, like, and this for the brain, the amygdala is buried real deep inside there. And that has become what we think of as our fear center. And it's not the only thing that's acting when we talk about fear, but that's one of the predominant parts of the brain that's acting. A lot of these parts of the brain act in concert. And then the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is another part of the brain, has a lot to do with memory, so does the amygdala, but the hippocampus has a lot to do with pulling short-term memory into long-term memory. And when I think about, especially when it comes to work with trauma, is the hippocampus taking memories through that portion of the brain is really important to put kind of like a time date stamp on it. If you're thinking, remember the old library? Mm-hmm. Well, they still do that. Yeah, we still stamp it, right, at the library with the time and the date. So that's what the hippocampus does, and then it stores information in the prefrontal cortex, which is all of this part up here, right? It's a more developed part. It's what we say adolescents don't totally have developed, which is why they act a little crazy. And in theory, once you're, 22 and a little bit older, all that brain material is developed. And that's where we store a lot of information. You've heard of the autonomic nervous systems? So that's the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems. They work with the brain, and the brain initiates those to do a lot of fun stuff in our bodies, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then the vagal nerve is something else that I think about a lot when I think about brain. It's a nerve that comes directly from your brain down and winds right down in it, right from your brain to your heart, which I think explains a lot of our, well, obviously, you'll see. I think I never knew when I heard about this. Have you all heard about that? That there's a nerve that actually comes straight from your brain to your heart. I had never heard this until 5-10 years ago. And I was like, what? That makes so much sense. Now I know why my heart responds so quickly to my brain. So Stephen Porges talks about a metaphor of safety. We won't go into everything he talks about. He's not the only one that talks about this. This is just a way to help conceptualize it. This diagram comes from him. The whole concept necessarily doesn't come from him. So we have what's going on outside our bodies, and that's giving us information, and it's giving our brain information, right? And if we're feeling safe, if what we're perceiving is safe, then we're engaging with people, we're able to have eye contact, we feel calm, right? You probably all feel, well, especially the extroverts in the room, right? They probably feel pretty calm. Maybe if you have some social anxiety, maybe that's not where you're at right now. Your facial expression's going to show that we're expressing this sense of safety. But then what happens when we don't feel safe? There's another set of what happens to us when we feel danger, right? And we have defensive strategies. You've heard of fight or flight? And where that came from? Do I need to? So you all know, like, many centuries ago, when our ancestors had to, hunt for their food and fight off tigers and bears or whatever they had to do. This was a really helpful system, right? Because what happened when the tiger jumped out at you? Your body was ready to either fight the tiger, right, or flee. So either one would be very helpful in a moment of danger. And as we progressed over the years, we still have that instinct inside us. So we still have that danger kind of warning that goes off, and then it initiates all sorts of stuff in our bodies. That's familiar, right? Fight or flight? Okay, good. And we'll talk a little bit in a second about why, although it's helpful now, maybe it's not so helpful in the way it continually gets triggered in our bodies now in 21st century. And then there's something called freeze. So everybody's heard about fight or flight. Have you heard about freeze as well? And this is more of a theory of a defensive strategy. So that if the threat is so big, then the idea would be that the body would just freeze. You can see how maybe that would be helpful if you need to play dead in a certain situation to survive, especially centuries and centuries ago. And that still is initiated in an extreme sense of powerlessness in someone who's experiencing a trauma where they actually have absolutely no power. We find that a lot of the time their bodies freeze in terms of being able to survive. And then what happens with their mind is another issue, because either it's fully engaged and knows exactly what's going on, which is something that we can deal with later, or it also disengages in a very different way, and then we'd have to deal with that in another way. Okay, so yes, we got it so far. So we have all sorts of things that can happen to us that can initiate that fight, flight, or freeze response, and I think of it as the car accident, the orange sweater, and the to-do list, and I'll tell you what I mean by all of those. So we have big T traumas, and that's when I'm saying like the car accident. There's all sorts of big T traumas that could happen. But the orange sweater, I'm going to talk about it in a minute. To me, so this is something that I use with my clients because I had a client who, when she was littler, when she was in elementary school, wore an orange sweater to school. And everybody, for some reason, made fun of her orange sweater. And she remembers that time as something being really painful. And although you may not consider that a big T, I would not consider that a big T trauma, right? There was nothing she was not in danger. Her body was not in danger. She wasn't in danger of dying or anything. But she was hurt emotionally. And so that is a small T trauma that stuck with her for many years. And then we have things like the to-do list, which is not a trauma at all, but it actually is a stressor that initiates all these same systems that we have, right? You know what I mean when I say the to-do list? So it's anything that makes you feel like, oh, right? You know that feeling, and we'll talk about that feeling. So when any of those things happen, it sends a message to the body like, danger, danger. I heard a speaker one time, she had an English accent, and every time I think about this, she said, danger, danger. So I always think about danger, danger. So maybe that'll help you remember. So the amygdala here is like, danger, danger. So either there's a car accident, or someone's laughing at my orange sweater, or, oh my gosh, I have a million things to do today. And my body says, uh-oh, danger, danger. You're in a time where you need to either fight, or flee, or maybe freeze. And then what happens? Then we initiate the sympathetic nervous system. And so then we've got all these things on the left, that's the sympathetic nervous system. And actually what happens is the amygdala sends out this signal to your body, and you already know this, and it doesn't go through the rest of your brain. It's the amygdala just kind of taking over and deciding, hey, you're in danger, go. Because obviously if we had to stop and think like, well, I'm gonna, like centuries ago, right? Well, I'm gonna kill this tiger, should I get out the bow and arrow, or should I run? You know, like, you wouldn't have time to do that because the tiger would have pounced on you and you'd be dead. So our bodies have come up with this great system where we don't have to think, we just respond in times of crisis and in danger. Well, that was great many centuries ago, but now when the to-do list also initiates that same fight or flight response in your body, and you're not even recognizing it, that can be really dangerous to your body. So we have things like, you can think about, okay, so let's talk about what would you need. Have you heard of those incidents where like the mom like lifts the car off the baby or something? Have you heard of that? So what can you imagine, what kinds of systems in your body would need to be active if you were in physical danger? And you can cheat and look up there. What
blood circulation.
Blood circulation, right? What else? Muscles. Yep. Respiration. Yes. You're going to need to see really well. What would you not need in that moment? Yeah, you don't need to eat, you just need to be acting, right? So we shut that down. What else? actually don't need to be reproducing. Your body doesn't need to be worried about that. So that system, for the most part, shuts down. You really don't need to have to worry about going to the bathroom in the middle of running away from a tiger. So that's shutting down. Does this make sense? So you've got all these systems are being activated, and the things that you need in your body to be able to fight a physical danger is being activated, but everything else that you wouldn't need is shut down. And that's the sympathetic nervous system. And then we have the parasympathetic nervous system, and if you speak Spanish like I do, you know, para means to stop. So it's really easy for me to remember this. So you have a sympathetic nervous system saying, danger, 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 and then the parasympathetic nervous system says, no, it's okay, you can calm down, you're safe, everything's okay. And then it initiates everything on the right side, right? You don't need to have your pupils so dilated anymore. You can salivate, and you can digest your food now. You can go to the bathroom. You can reproduce and do the things that you need to do that. So you don't have to be breathing so hard or having your blood pump so fast. So I'm sure this is not entirely a new concept, right? Maybe to some of you. So that's what's happening to us. Can you see the danger in, let's see if I can talk about that. Yeah. You see the danger in, so we're not fighting tigers, as I said anymore. We're dealing with to-do lists, or give me some of your stressors. What are you dealing with? So I have children. Yeah. So just like that, there's my baseline. There you go, 2-year-old. There's my stressor, right? Or somebody else's stressor. Do you deal with work stress? Do you have like a mean boss, or some colleagues who aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, and you're getting in trouble, or they're, oh man, the heater just broke in our house and we don't have the money to cover that, or things like that.
We have to move.
We have to move. Oh gosh, that's a huge stressor. Mm-hmm. Well, what happens is your body, your amygdala frequently says, uh-oh, danger, danger, and it initiates that system, your sympathetic nervous system, and it's overwhelming your body with all these hormones to help you fight a tiger, but you don't need to fight the tiger. You need to like figure out how to move, or deal with your 2-year-old, or deal with the cranky boss, or whatever, right? So what we find is in our society, we complain a lot about just lots of stressors, long-term stressors, and going through them all the time. And what happens when you're constantly under stress? And you can think about this as we're going to go on. This is for maybe people who aren't dealing with small T traumas all the time, or big T traumas all the time. If you can imagine somebody in Syria, for example, their bodies would be turned on to a higher degree all the time too. But we end up with a suppressed immune system, right? Because your body is not in the middle of fighting your cold when it's got to fight the tiger. So increased blood pressure, blood sugar, digestive problems. Have you heard of IBS? Did you know that a lot of the time people with IBS are prescribed an antidepressant? It's all related. Decreased libido. A lot of us could probably relate to that. You feel really stressed. You're not really feeling like having a romantic Valentine's Day. And reproductive difficulties. So all of those are related with long-term stress, and especially going up the list in terms of trauma, you're going to find a lot of that. So I want to explain a little bit more about what happens with the orange sweater. So my client who had the orange sweater issue, what happens when you have that memory of like danger, your brain is really trying to help you out, and it wants you to know, okay, there was danger there, so I want you to be able to respond the next time you see a similar danger. So frequently what it does, that memory is stored in your amygdala, so that your amygdala can always be ready to say, that's it, danger, danger. So this is an example, and this is an extreme way to explain this, but it wasn't necessarily what was happening with my client. But it could happen so much so that your brain latches on to a certain part of that event. For example, an orange sweater. My sweater was orange, and now, this isn't necessarily always what's happening. This is just an example. But now, when I see orange, it might trigger, like my amygdala might say, remember, that was dangerous, and then all of a sudden my body's being washed with all those stress hormones because my body is ready to fight or flee. You got it? And that memory hangs out in the amygdala so that you're always ready to respond, and it doesn't necessarily go through the hippocampus and get that time-date stamp on it. So then what does that mean? It means that I'm re-experiencing that memory over and over again as if it were happening in the present, even though it's not. So I see somebody else with an orange sweater. I'm not in 4th grade anymore, but my brain doesn't know that, and it's just responding as if I were in 4th grade. Does that make sense? And then you have this idea of neurons that fire together, wire together. So in our brains we have neural pathways, and when those neurons keep going off together, so like for example, orange and danger, I'm creating this pathway in my brain. So if you hike at all, I don't know how adventurous you are, I generally stay on the path because it's easier, right? It's the easier way to go. You don't have to like clear the brush away. Your brain is the same way. It just stays on the path. It stays on that neural pathway. So once you have a pathway in your brain, that's established and your brain continues to go down that path. And we do that a lot, and it works out a lot. Great for, I memorize my cell phone number, and that pathway is like, it's automatic. This also happens with things like orange sweater, danger, and we've got that pathway set in our brain. But not to be entirely fatalistic, there's something called neuroplasticity. Have you heard of that? It's a concept that's kind of been coming around in the past, at least in my field, 5 to 10 years, we'll say. But that idea of, so it doesn't, just because you have these pathways set in your brain, it doesn't mean you can't make a new pathway. It's going to be hard to make that pathway, just like if you're hiking and you want to try to clear the path. It's hard, but you can do it, and your brain is the same way. It's not necessarily stuck. It doesn't have to be, but it's going to be really hard to create another pathway. So then, if this is what happens, just with a stressor, and we're talking about, it also happens with small t traumas, and it definitely happens with big T traumas. Then this is what happens to us, and this is what we know happens when people have experienced trauma. And you'll also see this happening in some degrees with small t traumas. So we're experiencing things, intrusive thoughts, that means like I just can't stop thinking about that even though I don't want to. Nightmares, sense of reliving the experience, even hallucinations, flashbacks. Then you have avoidance responses. So either I'm really trying to avoid it, or I just am and I don't know I'm trying to avoid it. Because that's really uncomfortable to think about all that pain and what was going on with the orange sweater, right? Or with a car accident, or with other things. So numbing, disengagement, we self-medicate. You know what that means when you self-medicate? So I'm going to just drink a lot of wine tonight so I don't have to think about it. And so maybe I can do that to the point of intoxication, or maybe not. Denial, things like that. Dissociation, which is a whole other topic. Arousal responses. So I have some clients, we talk about these as their spidey senses. This is when you're like I said, your brain is ready to respond in the danger situation. So you have your spidey senses ready, like it's always putting out, and it's ready to respond. And so if you have a lot of trauma in your life, these are really heightened, and you are constantly on alert and ready to go. But when you are, you can imagine it's really hard to sleep. It's really hard to concentrate. You're hypervigilant. You're going to be responding. Like you've heard of Vietnam vets. My dad was a Vietnam vet, and he had a hard time with fireworks for many years, and we can probably understand why. So that's one of those startle responses, and that's an effective trauma. Affect dysregulation, that means being able to control your emotions. So you have mood swings, some depression, acting out behaviors with kids or even adults. Dissociative responses to strong emotions. So if I feel really, really sad, I find a way to not be in that sadness at all. And it's kind of like my sister when the coach would yell at her in volleyball and she would laugh, which annoyed the crap out of the coach. But it was it's a dissociative response. I can't be with that uncomfortable fear or sadness. So that's really funny. And then problems with your relationships. If you've got someone who's traumatized, you can imagine in experiencing all that, you're going to have people that they're really, so you've got your spidey senses all the time, not just physically, but also emotionally. I'm always ready, especially if I've been hurt in the past, I'm always ready for you to hurt me. Because my brain is wired and ready to protect me. Abandonment issues, so thinking about oh, please don't leave me. A need for protection. So sometimes when you have people, you're like, man, you're really manipulating the heck out of me right now. Again, this is going back to what we said at the beginning, instead of thinking what's wrong with you? going back to that question in our heads, then what happened to you? And one thing that is not usually mentioned in a DSM, and I don't know why, because this is what therapists probably deal with more than anything, is shame, and a sense of shame. All right, so anybody familiar with the ACEs study? A little bit? Good. Good, I'm glad. Sorry. So what we have is, it's short for the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. So this was a longitudinal study and had, how many, 17,000 participants, right, between 1995 and 97 that they identified. And what they did is they took people and they were watching and they categorized childhood incidents of maltreatment. And they looked at that and then looked at their lives as they got older and what had happened to them. So what we're going to see are that, so they stacked it. So if you had a bunch of adverse childhood experiences, then what we think happens is you've got social, emotional, cognitive impairment. We just talked about all the things that can happen to you, right, if you've been traumatized. Which means that you might have some health risk behaviors, and then we're getting into things like disease and early death. So, if you haven't seen these numbers, I think they're pretty interesting. So over on the right, you'll see the number of categories of maltreatment reported. So these are really big T traumas that they're reporting, usually physical and emotional abuse and sexual abuse.
Neglect.
Yes, and neglect's right into that. Yeah, neglect. And also substance abuse in the home, domestic violence in the home. Those are the major ones that they're looking at. So big T traumas for kids. And seeing, so if you've got a certain amount of those reported, then what happens to you? So what I think you'll see is a pattern, right, in the data showing, for the most part, if you have 0 of those categories reported, you're less likely to experience some of the negative health and mental health outcomes. But the more trauma you experienced, the more of these that you're suffering from. To me, this seems like, of course, but until this study came out, I think even a lot of medical professionals especially were not making that connection. Although I think therapists have been trying to say that for a few years, and maybe some medical professionals. So yeah, we see smoking goes up, obesity goes up, depressed mood, attempted suicide. So alcoholism, using illicit drugs, having more intercourse partners, having an STD. Taking that, I don't know how fast to go. Take this in. Oh boy, we got a lot. That's okay. Ground to cover. What I don't totally know is why the numbers dip right here and go up, but you can definitely see the difference between having reported 0 maltreatment incidents and 4 or more. I mean, chronic bronchitis. Something you might not have guessed, but when we talked about what our bodies are doing when we think we're in danger, maybe that explains a little bit more. Diabetes, right? Stroke, heart disease. So all of these experienced at a higher level when people have higher incidents of trauma. And then there's something called intergenerational or transgenerational trauma. And this is so complex that I've got another slide that hopefully helps us understand it a little bit better. But basically it's that idea, the cumulative effects of trauma being experienced and being passed down from generation to generation. And that happens in several ways. And the awareness of this actually began with study of children of Holocaust survivors and seeing how, while they did not experience the Holocaust, there was a huge increase in symptoms that looked a lot like trauma in these children of Holocaust survivors. And so that's when I think people actually finally started studying it. And I know this to be true. I have a Jewish friend who is really more agnostic, but has his children in Hebrew school. And I'm like, you know, Sasha, why do you have it? He's like, your dad doesn't escape the Holocaust, and you just like clean your hands on Judaism. No, like it's important to me. So that's just like one tiny little thing that you can see happening just because of intergenerational trauma. So how does this work? In one way, so you have a parent or grandparent or several generations of grandparents who've been exposed to this trauma, and then the kids are hearing about it. So that's one thing that happens. And then one of the other things that happens is that you have children being parented by people who are traumatized. So if you take all of that list that we just saw of like all the effects of trauma, and you think about someone parenting in that situation, can you imagine them trying to do a good job when they're experiencing a good majority of those symptoms? So you can see how kids would not get the parenting they need, and then they're going to be not having all that they need to be able to deal with the world, and let me show you. So this is one slightly helpful way to think about it. So this is just if you took child abuse. So you've got a child who's abused. If they're suffering through all that they were suffering through, then often what happens when they're a kid, you're going to see that they have problems in school. Why do they have problems in school? Is that pretty obvious from what we talked about with the trauma symptoms? With, not being able to focus, and if you're always having your spidey senses on, all that kind of stuff. You might be aggressive, and then what happens when you're a teen? You drop out of school, maybe you're into substance abuse, a lot of depression, PTSD, anxiety, victimization. And then as an adult, we've got parenting problems, domestic violence, poverty. Like if you're dealing with, can you see like how it affects you as you're growing up? And then what happens as an adult? You tend to be more at risk of abusing your own children, which seems perhaps counterintuitive. Like, if you were abused, how could you possibly do that? When you have all these symptoms coming into play, it happens. Are we following how that can work in intergenerational trauma? And it just gets passed down and passed down. You also have, for example, we have lots of clients who've experienced sexual abuse, and it's happened in every generation that they know of, that they can think of. And you think, how could that possibly happen? But if you have parents who've been abused themselves and are trying to avoid thinking about that having happened to them, you're going to have a lot of parents who are not vigilant with their own children, not talking about it with their own children, and they're actually setting their children up without even knowing it to be victims of abuse. Making sense?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So, then let's shift a little bit and talk about trauma and minorities. Minorities, that's a huge term. Not everybody falls into exactly like what we might be talking about, so there's a different experience. When we think about minorities, there's different minority groups, and they experience things differently also. So I'm just putting it out there that this is a large idea, and maybe not all minorities fit this the way we're talking about this, but I'm going to trust that you guys can make those adjustments in your head, especially based on what you've been talking about in your class. So there's a study recently that kind of compared different minorities and their experience of trauma and PTSD. And it had some interesting findings. Basically, it found that whites actually have significantly higher exposure to any event, at least that they're reporting. And these are, again, big T traumas that are being reported. And then we have Hispanic and Blacks with significantly higher exposure to child maltreatment. So we have certain traumas that the data is showing that whites are more exposed to, and certain trauma that Hispanic and Blacks are more exposed to. And we also see that Asians actually are underrepresented in both experiencing these trauma experiences and PTSD. We won't get into exactly why all of that is, but just to know that, so the data is kind of mixed on who's experiencing trauma and how they are experiencing it. Oh, it's kind of off to, oh well. So hopefully you can figure this out, right? So that what we see is that, though that's probably obvious, the white bar is representing whites. The black bar is for Black African Americans, that middle bar is Hispanic, and then the one on the, no, I'm sorry, it's Asian, excuse me, and the one on the very right, the gray, is representing Hispanics. And what we see is that actually, that African Americans are experiencing PTSD symptoms actually at a higher rate. So there's a mix of maybe, you also have to think about who's reporting, how are they underreporting, and that these are what are considered like discrete incidents of big T trauma. But here's what we know, that often minorities, especially African Americans and Latinos, are experiencing disproportionate rates of things like poverty, right? Which includes unemployment, food security. You know what I mean when I say food security? Okay, good. Crime in neighborhoods, incarceration, lack of access to health care. When we think about big T trauma, we may not think of those as falling into big T trauma, Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I would definitely categorize those as little t trauma, and those are traumas that are probably experienced in a chronic way, ongoing. And then you have intergenerational trauma. If you think about what has happened to minorities in our country over the generations and carrying those stories forward, and those stories are being passed down generation to generation. Not only that, but we have continual, I don't know if we talked about this, and maybe you agree, disagree, continual levels of oppression continuing through generations. So all of that is compounding and compounding through generations, and that's what a lot of minorities are dealing with. And then we have something called microaggressions. Have you talked about microaggressions?
Not yet.
Okay. And I won't spend a whole lot of time on those, but basically, so this is one definition I've been given. The everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely on a group of marginalized membership. So these are the small things that are being said, or like ways that things are being said. Let me give you an example from me as a woman. One thing for me I consider a microaggression is people when they, and you've probably done this and don't feel offended that I'm not trying to call you out, but this old idea of like, oh well, her dad's gonna be there with a shotgun when the boyfriend gets there. And to me that is a microaggression because of all the implications that it has about women and their ability to protect themselves or their sexuality or whatever. All of that in one little sentence, but to me that's a microaggression against women, and I hear that, I hear it loud and clear. So we are guilty of committing those kinds of things all the time. I listed one recently too that I've committed. We at our office, we don't have a ramp for people who are disabled, and we have a few people that need to access our building that are in wheelchairs. And I would consider that, you might even consider it more than a microaggression against people who are disabled. Does that make sense? So small little things that happen, and I know this is a hard one to deal with, and I think people, like especially, you can even look at our political culture, or some people are really don't want to hear about this, don't want to think about it, think it's like, oh, we're being overly PC, and I'll let you have your opinions about that, but I'll also let you know that there are people that are experiencing these microaggressions as small t traumas every day. And what we think about then is this idea of death by 1,000 nicks. So small t trauma, like happening over and over and over and over again. And that's just your present day experience. And then you have intergenerational trauma and maybe other traumas that have happened to you. So then what happens? We don't have a lot of time, and I was hoping some of you I'm not a macro person, I don't think big, I think really small. I'm assuming that some of you are putting this together in your head already, of thinking about we've got trauma, and we have a community that's much more at risk of experiencing trauma. So you have a whole community that I think you can consider has actually been traumatized. Right? So we have community experiences of trauma plus powerlessness. And I'm assuming maybe you've talked a lot about powerlessness. All coming to bear on especially minority communities. So we have high exposure to big T trauma, high exposure to little T trauma, and intergenerational trauma, which I said. And then what happens? What does the community do in response? So we saw how an individual might respond in their symptoms. What do you see as a community? Like, what is the response of a community that has been traumatized?
The Ferguson response.
The Ferguson response.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Of anger and violence.
Anger and violence. Yeah. And maybe within this context of trauma, that makes a little bit more sense. I do want to add a caveat, which is we can have a trauma response over here, and you can also have an anger response, which isn't necessarily due to trauma. But what I think about, especially therapists probably think about this, is anger is a really helpful tool for us to let us know when somebody's crossing our boundaries. So, and I'm sure in church you've talked about, like, Jesus was angry, and it's what you do with that anger. Like, it's not bad to be mad. We have to think about what we do with that anger, but it's not bad to be mad. So, anger is also a very appropriate response in a lot of, to what has happened to a community that has been oppressed. So that's over here. And you also have a community that has been traumatized and is suffering from trauma. Does that make sense? I don't want to just say, oh, well, they're traumatized and that's why they're doing that, and act like that all of a community's response is pathological, because it's not necessarily. But just, I want you to hold both of those. And then before we end, know this. So that same brain wiring that works in with minorities, we also have this going on as majorities, right? So our brains are programmed to tell us when something is different. And that is normal. It's helpful, because that's how I know that I'm not supposed to eat that berry, I'm supposed to eat that berry, or at least that's how it was centuries and centuries ago, right? So our brains are used to telling us, nope, nope, that one of these things is not like the other. Remember that little thing from Sesame Street? And that's to keep us safe. And when we live in in a homogenous kind of environment, it gets even more triggered when something looks different. And so, do you see where I'm going with this? It's maybe uncomfortable and maybe not. So when I think about the responses that people have to somebody that looks different, I'm not trying to tell you that something's wrong with you. When something looks different than what you're used to, that's not your brain's normal response. That's how it's going to respond, like danger. And then it's the rest of your brain's job to come in and say, oh, you know what? They may look that person may look different. They may be different, but it doesn't mean that they are dangerous. Like, thank you, amygdala, for trying to alert me. There's that. So you can use your higher brain function, and that's what we need to do. Then I also challenge you to think, how can I put myself in environments where my brain is not going to automatically assume that that thing is different than everything else I see? So that my brain doesn't respond that way all the time. Say what? It's true, right? And it's normal. And how do I create an environment for myself where my brain is not always saying, that's different, that's dangerous? Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. And as we wrap up, so common treatment strategies for therapists, we often use things like establishing safety for our clients who've been traumatized, helping them make sure they're establishing physical safety, but also like around them in their environment, and also in their person, so being able to soothe themselves and calm themselves and get that parasympathetic nervous system to say, okay, it's not dangerous anymore, but not until it's really not dangerous anymore. Okay? And then we have a common intervention is helping people retell their story, and a therapist often being the witness of that story. And then reintegration, so integrating all this information that they have about their past into who they are as a person, and not having it be so separate, but as part of their story, and as part of how it makes them who they are, and what they bring to the present. So then my question is, how do we do this on a systemic level, as a community, right? Because you're not going to be able to do this individually with people that you know that have been traumatized, but how do you do it as a community? And that's what I leave you with in reflection questions. And these are not answered right now necessarily, but so I want you to think about, how do your own experiences of trauma, big T or little t trauma, help you relate to someone else who's experienced trauma, even if it's a trauma that's very different from yours? What role does the majority in a community or society play in intergenerational trauma? What are the possibilities of applying common treatment strategies for trauma at different systemic levels? And then you, especially all as a body, what is the church's role in responding then to systemic trauma? I think next week you're going to have a really good discussion about maybe moving into that idea. So I offer this as a prelude to that, thinking about, so what is our role? That's what I've got. What kind of questions or comments do you all have? Probably more comments than questions. Yeah.
So, we've seen certain groups of people that have been traumatized in major ways. You talked about the Holocaust, make it think of the Japanese, being bombed, cities destroyed. Are there any studies, or you talk about systematic ways of communities, any studies from those major events and how those communities overcame that trauma, or to allow it to become intergenerational over some period of time?
I'm not familiar with. That would be worth researching. researching. I'm not familiar with any.
Because it seems like if the Jewish people or the Japanese, you know, bomb dropped on them, or even earthquakes in California survivors, if they learned some lesson or just something that was done in the community to help them overcome that trauma, how would you apply that to our present day situation in Ferguson, for example? What would you do in Ferguson based on those learnings?
So there are definitely people out there that work on a community-wide level, and I can look into getting you some of that information. So there are people that do community interventions, for sure. In those specific instances that you're talking about, I'm not sure if things were done, especially considering the time frame that it happened in. But there are things that are happening now, of course, on more micro levels. And if you want examples, I'll have to get back to you. But I mean, like, I work with a woman who's an art therapist, and she works with community art projects in this with the same idea, right, of bringing communities together to work through these issues. We tried it with the Latino community out in Baldwin, and guess who showed up to our interventions, to our community art activities? The Latinos did, but the white community didn't. So we're still learning too. Yeah. Oh, sure.
I don't want to kind of detour us, but the research on those particular events and trauma as it relates to history suggests that the Japanese and the communities who suffered during the Holocaust took agency over their suffering in important ways, different ways, culturally distinct ways, not surprisingly, but for the Holocaust, the key function of storytelling and of Truth and Reconciliation Commission work, where investigation was matched with storytelling, and was a really important part of gaining a sense of agency over traumatic experience. You talked about how important storytelling is, not just in the therapeutic setting, but on a kind of cultural level. Narrating trauma becomes a really, and those communities that create mechanisms for telling their stories seem to have the capacity to, if you think of the Holocaust as kind of a dramatic case of this, I mean, we now have on the wall in DC, we now have a museum devoted to Holocaust memory, and we as a culture have made room for that kind of storytelling on a fairly large scale. We read Holocaust survivor narratives in school. We've developed a vocabulary for that. I would argue we haven't done that in the case of African American trauma, slavery, the history of slavery, and the persistence of slavery. The narratives are present in the culture, but they are not part of a kind of mass experience of remembering. So that's one answer. I mean, it's not an answer on the level of psychotherapy or
Right. No, that's a great answer. And I haven't done a whole lot with thinking about how we apply this to like the idea of Ferguson. But I come back to the idea of, so what's the baseline when we work, especially with trauma victims, who really want, like ideally, we want to have safety. And the idea of like this trauma, this hurt is not going to keep happening to me, so then I can open up and talk about it. That's not always what happens. There is trauma therapy that happens when that's not the case. But that's our ideal, and are we even there yet? So we're asking a lot of a community to tell their story in the midst of still feeling like they are being traumatized over and over. Yeah.
I once had a conversation. We had a Nigerian pastor who was a guest, and I took him to meet an African-American pastor in the PCA. And we sat down, and I had what I thought was a perfectly normal conversation. I asked James, the African-American pastor, where he was born, how he grew up, just asked him about his story. And he told my Nigerian friends later, I left them and they went on that conversation, and I picked the Nigerian pastor up later. And he told me that I was the first white person who had ever asked James those questions. Just what I would call normal, where do you come from, what's your background kind of question. And I was astounded.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but child care workers are letting me know that they need us to get the 4s and 5s. So if you have children up in the 4s and 5s, please go ahead and relieve the workers. Stay after, talk to Meredith. She's happy to continue talking about these issues. Next week, Dr. Perry from Covenant Seminary is going to come to talk about individual and corporate lament. So you don't want to miss that one. And then the next week we'll have a built-in process week, right, Heidi? And we'll be talking more about this and the lament. So thank you all so much for being here, and please come talk to Meredith and I afterwards. Thanks, Meredith.